Ensuing chaos, examine how the country could fall so rapidly and what it means for the most vulnerable and also regional stability. And later in the program, New South Wales has its deadliest day of the pandemic while Melbourne reimposes a COVID curfew, and political turmoil in Malaysia after the nation's embattled Prime Minister quits. I'm Bev O'Connor, you're watching The World. Well, it was a swift, brutal and calculated campaign. Just 3 months after starting their offensive against Western-backed and trained security forces, the Taliban have seized control of Afghanistan. Few analysts expected the dizzying speed with which the advance happened, and the fall of Kabul was not predicted for months. In the end, it took under 24 hours. The civilian government has collapsed. The President, Ashraf Ghani, has fled the nation. Meanwhile, foreign nationals are scrambling to evacuate their people, prompting chaos at the Hamid Karzai International Airport. Australian forces will be among those attempting to evacuate our citizens, along with Afghans and their families who have worked closely with our troops. Inside the country, there are grave fears for many vulnerable groups, especially women and children who were not allowed to work or even study when the Taliban was last in power. Up until recent months, the Taliban has been trying to present itself as a reformed, more moderate group. But civilians are fearful and distrusting as they push to form government. Let's hear what some of their leaders have to say.
We are not against the education of boys and girls. The policy of Emirate is that both have to be educated as long as the Islamic Sharia laws are not neglected. With the hijab, girls of all ages can get educated. There is no problem. The Emirate wants every single member of the nation to be educated. If it's Islamic, modern or higher education, we are fully supportive of learning and we are committed to it. We want our nation to be educated.
I think an Afghan inclusive government, this is the demand, the will and the want of the people of Afghanistan. They want this government that you may have seen that when ever we entered the provincial cities, people thronged along the roads and queued up along the roads, and they were welcoming our forces. So it is a popular uprising. As a result of that, all the provinces fell to us.
Before, we didn't have as much responsibility as we do today, because now we are all tested by God. Day by day, we will get involved in the service of our nation, in providing them with security and hope for their future.
Well, the Taliban's campaign to take back Afghanistan was enacted with deadly efficiency. But just how did this militant group regain control of the country? Andrea Neerhoff takes a look at how we got to today.
The provincial capital of Zarand was the Taliban's first casualty, captured on August 6. It started a chain reaction of militant occupation, with towns including Kunduz, Talakan and Aibak falling soon after. Local leaders were scathing of the government's supposed resistance.
The government didn't pay proper attention to this province. Whether you call it a failure, lack of attention, corruption or whatever from the government, it all resulted in them handing over this province to the Taliban easily.
No potential outcome has to be inevitable, including the fall of Kabul, which everybody seems to be reporting about. It doesn't have to be that way.
August 13 saw 4 provincial capitals fall in a day, including Kandahar, known as Afghanistan's second city and the spiritual home of the Taliban, as well as Lashkar Gah and Herat. And veteran resistance fighter Mohammed Ismail Khan was taken into Taliban custody.
I hope the Taliban will be able to bring about an atmosphere of peace and create security and stability in Afghanistan.
As the noose around Kabul tightened, fourth largest city Mazar-e Sharif was the next to fall under the fundamentalist group's control. 3 days earlier, it had been visited by Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani.
Though I know that you are concerned about the present and future, I assure you that as your president, my focus is on preventing further instability, violence and displacement of my people. I will do my best to prevent this imposed war on the Afghan people.
In an effort to try and stop the Taliban's march, the US sent more troops back to the nation. But it was too little, too late. On August 15, Jalalabad became Taliban territory, effectively leaving Kabul as the final government outpost. Kabul's fate all but sealed, and its people with nowhere to go. Andrea Niehoff, ABC News.
Well, we're yet to hear from the US President Joe Biden, but pressure is mounting on him to explain how security in Afghanistan unravelled so quickly. ABC correspondent Greg Jennett is in Washington.
Rotors overhead, rapid-fire rounds from the sides. The American military beat a retreat from the doomed embassy to a now familiar soundtrack. The Taliban hadn't been this close in this number since supporters trashed and burnt the old embassy as the US bombed its government into submission. Now the outlaws are back in Kabul, in command of forces America spent billions of dollars standing up, only to be sorely let down when it mattered.
The inability of Afghan security forces to defend their country has played a very powerful role in what we've seen.
The Biden administration smarting over a litany of failures, several of its own making, and it'll soon have harder calls to make, like whether to recognise the new government.
See if there can be a peaceful settlement, a peaceful transfer of power.
A process made tougher still by the Taliban's early actions, releasing thousands of hardcore violent extremists from prisons.
What we're watching right now in Afghanistan is what happens when America withdraws from the world. So everybody who has been saying America needs to withdraw, America needs to retreat, we are getting a devastating, catastrophic, real-time lesson in what that means.
The distrust, disillusion and despair at decisions made cuts deep.
We cannot do anything. We cannot do anything.
Especially through America's Afghan community. Many ended up here fleeing the Taliban.
I think that you can't trust a terrorist group, and you are fooling yourself if you think that you can.
They came 20 years back to help us get out of this situation, and now we somehow are going back to the same situation.
America will bear responsibility for what happens next. First, by picking up some of the pieces of any humanitarian crisis. Then comes the reckoning on how its war came to such a rapid and disastrous end, and why no one seems to have seen it coming.
The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
The call to account has barely begun. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Washington.
Well, there are growing concerns for the safety of Australians in Afghanistan. The government has approved a military evacuation mission, but given the deteriorating security situation in the capital, it's not clear when Australian troops will be able to land in Kabul. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Mission into mayhem. Coalition forces dispatched for one last push. Australia sending more than 250 troops, a refueler jet and 2 large transport aircraft.
Around the other side.
For a treacherous end to Australia's long involvement in Afghanistan, one that's been both a military slog and a political marathon. Through 7 prime ministerships, a bipartisan commitment to an international mission that's morphed over the years. From kill and capture of Osama bin Laden and defeat of al-Qaeda to nurturing a fragile Afghan government. A 2-decade intervention disintegrating into chaos and ruin.
That is the story of Afghanistan. It is a tragic place.
Australia's final task, a dangerous extraction to rescue civilian Australians and Afghans who served with the ADF.
To leave in a safe and orderly way. The challenge, of course, is making sure that that is the circumstance that applies in Kabul.
The scenes in Kabul underscoring how difficult that'll be.
We've had from April till now to think about what we were going to do, and here we are now at the 11th hour, caught short.
The future of all Afghans uncertain, but especially women and girls.
It's very hard. It's breaking my heart to see my country like this.
Zainab Kazemi's family fled Afghanistan a decade ago. Her father, one of thousands to arrive in Australia by boat. Relatives left behind in fear of Taliban retribution.
They're going to kill all those women who have worked for the government, all those women who have spoken up.
We should be opening our hearts and opening our country to them.
The humanitarian disaster erupting in Afghanistan brings its own moral questions and challenges. Australia and other nations involved in the 20-year conflict will carry a particular responsibility. As for those we've already promised safe haven, the distressing scenes at Kabul airport suggest keeping that vow will be difficult.
Leaving behind a lot of people who helped us, and I think just God help them. God help them.
Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, I'm joined now by Lynn O'Donnell, an Australian journalist, author and analyst who had returned to the country to report on the withdrawal of foreign troops. Now, she managed to flee before the airport closed. She's now in Dordrecht in the Netherlands. Lynn, it's good to see you safe. You had got out in the nick of time. How hard was it in the end to get out?
Oh, thanks, Bev. I had booked my ticket about a week earlier. The last time you and I talked, I was in Herat, the big city in the west, and it was very clear that things were going pear-shaped there. You might remember we talked about me spending time on the front line there. The Taliban were coming into the city. I'd originally planned to stay just 2 days and ended up spending 5 because the taking and losing of the airport road and rocketing of the airport was going on there for days. So it was while I was in Herat and waiting for an opportunity to leave there that I decided, along with Masood Hosseini, the Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer from Afghanistan that I work with and worked with over the 3 months that I was in Afghanistan, we decided it was time to go. So we booked tickets and left. When we got to the airport yesterday morning, the streets were absolutely clear of any security presence at all. It's been called the Ring of Steel for the last 5 or 7 years. It just wasn't there. It had melted away. The airport itself was orderly because people were there with tickets. We were on the last flight, wheels up at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the airport closed under Taliban firing and shelling a little while later, and you've seen the scenes that have ensued. We've also heard that the Taliban have been setting up checkpoints on the airport road, stopping people in their cars, searching their stuff, seizing their passports, burning them. It's a pretty devastating situation at the moment.
So to that point, from what you're hearing, it sounds as if they do not intend to allow people who are in fear of their lives to get out.
Clearly they don't, and nothing they say can be taken at its word. They were on the outskirts of Kabul on Saturday night. There was the firing and the fighting was audible in some parts of town, just 20, 25 kilometres outside. They said on Sunday morning, we won't be entering the city. A couple of hours later, they're there in the city, armed gunmen in the parks, in the streets. They've closed the shops. They've painted over any billboards that have women's pictures on them. They're liars, they're murderers, they're drug dealers, and everywhere they've taken over the past 3 or 4 months, they've gone in and they go door to door looking for people who work for the government, journalists, women's rights activists, human rights advocates. These are drug dealers on a world scale. They can't be trusted, and what comes next is anybody's guess.
Lynn, this day, what we've been witnessing at the airport has been likened to the fall of Saigon. Was this collapse inevitable?
No, I don't think it was inevitable at all. It's been 20 years since 9/11 and the subsequent invasion by US and UK troops initially. There were 35, 40 nations present there, including the Aussies in Uruzgan, for quite some time. The Americans alone have spent more than $80 billion developing the country's defence and security sector. And that means everything: Army, Air Force, police, special forces, whatever you would need to do that, the Afghans have been given. We've talked before about the combat missions winding down 31st of December 2014. Ashraf Ghani by then was already the president. He had more than 6 years to come to terms with the fact that he was now the leader. He had to come up with a strategy. He had to work with his defence minister, his interior minister. He never did that. He's a micromanager. He changed those important positions, I don't know, like some people change their underwear. And there was no consistency, no leadership. The money was pilfered. I wrote about this for Foreign Policy magazine last week. Billions of dollars disappeared, and I visited soldiers and police and militia on the front lines, and they didn't have food, let alone ammunition and weapons. It's just been a rout, and it's been a rout because if you don't believe in what you're fighting for, you're not going to fight. If you don't have weapons to fight, if you're not being fed, if your full salary isn't reaching you, and that's been across the board for a long time, then why fight? That's right. How people felt.
Indeed. So you can't send an army out without food. It's the greatest adage in history. Now, Russian officials are saying that the president, the very man you talk about, Ashraf Ghani, abandoned the country with cars and a helicopter full of cash. So full of cash that he couldn't fit it all in. He had to leave some behind. This is the man the US felt they could leave in charge.
Yes, and did leave in charge for quite a long time and supported him as the winner of elections that were widely contested and incredibly corrupt. I think they felt they could work with Ashraf Ghani. He's essentially an American citizen, a lecturer at Harvard University, an anthropologist, and he wrote a book called Saving Failed States.
And here we are. It's tragic. Lynn, we're talking a lot about who's on the streets at the moment. It's the Taliban. It's people putting fear into the lives of so many. Who is not on the streets? We're not seeing many women, are we, in this chaos?
No, we're not. No, you're absolutely right, Bev. The stories that have unfolded over the country while the Taliban have been on this incredibly rapid advance in recent months have been of how women have been treated. They've gone into districts and into provincial cities over the past week or 10 days and said everything's going to be fine, as in your clip just now. We believe in education. But what they don't say is that we believe in education according to how we interpret what education is. Everything's going to be done according to Islam. And what interpretation of Islam is that? This is what we're not hearing. But in practice, it's taking girls out of school and closing the girls' schools. It's forcing women not to work, to stay home, to only leave their houses with a male relative and in full hijab. People are being told, women who work are being told, you go home now and the men in your family can take your job. Half the population is about to disappear. But, it's not just how bad it is and was before, and here we are going back to the future. There's also been incredible stories of going door to door and finding people who are rights advocates, journalists, working women, and disappearing them, bodies turning up in open ground. This is a really different and much, much worse situation than existed when they were in control 1996 to 2001. It's a new Taliban indeed, but it's a worse Taliban than it was.
Lynn, we appreciate your reporting indeed, and as I said at the start, we're so grateful to hear that you are safe. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So just who are the Taliban today and what roles do some of the key leaders play in the group? Yvonne Yong has taken a look.
The men you see here taking over Afghanistan's presidential palace had been planning this for years. The group they belong to, the Taliban, translated to students in English, have been trying to get back into power ever since they were toppled 20 years ago. They're currently led by Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada. He took over when his predecessor, Akhtar Mansour, was killed in a US drone strike in 2016. He's about 60 years old and holds final authority over the Taliban's political, religious and military affairs. Second in charge is Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, one of the co-founders of the Taliban and now head of the political office in Doha. He was captured in Pakistan in 2010 but freed in 2018, after which he relocated to Qatar. He's been part of the group's negotiating team, which in recent months has failed to make headway in striking a peace deal. Sirajuddin Haqqani doubles as both deputy leader and head of the powerful Haqqani Network, a US-designated terror group considered one of the most dangerous in Afghanistan. He's believed to be in his late 40s or early 50s and is the son of prominent Mujahideen commander Jalaluddin Haqqani. Mullah Yaqub is the son of this man pictured here, Taliban founder Mullah Omar. As military chief, Mullah Yaqub, said to be in his 30s, oversees the strategic operations of the war. Abdul Hakim Haqqani is the head of the Taliban's negotiating team. He's widely believed to be the person the Supreme Leader trusts the most. And a face we've seen a lot of in recent days, that of Suhail Shaheen, the Taliban spokesman and member of the negotiation committee too.
Well, let's get more international reaction to the fall of Kabul. Britain's Defence Secretary became emotional and admitted he believes not everyone will be able to get out of the country as it slips under Taliban control. Ben Wallace says the UK is planning to fly out around 1,500 people from Afghanistan in the coming days.
We are simply there to process all those British passport holders and all those people we have an obligation to. And, you know, our men and women of our armed forces are risking their lives in doing that. But that is the right thing to do. They've risked their lives the last 20 years. At the very least, our obligation has to be as many of these people through the pipeline as possible. But I think I also said, and it's a really deep part of regret for me, that some people won't get back. Some people won't get back. And we will have to do our best in third countries to process those people.
Why do you feel it so personally, Mr. Wallace?
Because I'm a soldier. Because it's sad, and the West has done what it's done. And we have to do our very best, Nick, to get people out and stand by our obligations. And 20 years of sacrifice is what it is.
China says it's in contact with the Taliban in Afghanistan and is looking forward to helping develop the nation. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying says Beijing hopes the militant group will bring lasting peace to the country.
China maintains contact and communication with the Afghan Taliban and others on the basis of full respect for the national sovereignty of Afghanistan and the will of various factions in the country. China has been playing a constructive role in promoting a political settlement of the Afghanistan issue. We hope that the Afghan Taliban will unite with all parties and ethnic groups in Afghanistan to build a broad and inclusive political structure that suits Afghanistan's own national conditions and lay the foundation for the realisation of lasting peace in Afghanistan. The Afghan Taliban have repeatedly expressed their hope to develop good relations for China and look forward to China's participation in the reconstruction and development of Afghanistan, and will never allow any forces to use Afghan territory to do things that endanger China.
Well, in 1992, Safi Omid was just 4 years old when he and his family fled a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. For 10 years, they stayed in Pakistan as refugees before deciding to return home. He now lives in Melbourne with his wife and children, but his parents and siblings remain in Afghanistan. He says the Taliban has once again shattered the hopes of millions.
I haven't slept for the last few hours, and last night especially. The timing of this news in the midst of this lockdown could not get any worse. I'm certainly thinking about my family and the millions of other Afghans currently in Afghanistan facing this uncertainty, fear, and anxiety. So it was quite unexpected. Although we were following the news of the deteriorating situation in the past few months, but it's just happened overnight, and it just feels like a dream.
Have you been able to talk to your family?
Yes, fortunately, I have been in touch with them. I spoke with them this morning. They, if I'm feeling it this way here, living in Australia, but they're actually feeling the anxiety, the fear, and uncertainty even more. And they are safe. They're in Kabul. They are safe, but we just don't know what's going to happen next.
And what is your sense of whether there's going to be mass retribution by the Taliban against families like yours that were in some way involved with either the government, with coalition troops?
That's a quite very important sentiment or concern that we all have. Most of the Australians here are first-generation Australians. We have deep roots back home, and we just want to make sure that they're all safe. And we're all, to be honest, quite concerned about this situation and the future of our families and their quality of life.
Now, you've been fortunate enough to come and live in Australia, but you had gone back to Afghanistan. Had you had hopes for the future of the country?
Quite a lot. I have studied overseas. I've wanted to go back to my country. I've established my career thinking about the future of Afghanistan and wanting to go back there and work there. And all of a sudden now everything feels unachievable, and the hope that millions of Afghans had and built over the last 20 years. This is all coming shattering quite rapidly, and it all of a sudden feels like we are starting from ground zero again, and that is quite a sense that I really wish that it didn't happen, and we just really hope that we can go back to our country and then just make sure that things go back to normal.
And Safi, some people are asking today, what was the point of the last 20 years? Do you feel that's all been wiped out? Were there any gains that can be held on to?
For the past 20 years, we certainly have had achievements in terms of sports, cultural achievements, arts, and structural development. But of course, all of those things need to be carried out. Like, we absolutely need the international support right now more than any time. And, we don't want them to leave us and forget about us at this crucial time. And given that the situation right now is even more bad than it was. Like, we've got a lot of things to lose now than we did before. It is very important for the international community in Australia, especially Australian and the international community, to double up their efforts, to increase their efforts, and if at all, increase in their level of support and humanitarian support for Afghanistan.
Safi, do you think people in Afghanistan will feel a sense of betrayal?
Absolutely. We certainly believe that we have been left alone. We have been betrayed by our politicians, and we are now here in this sort of situation because of the large number of corruption and the international community's withdrawal from Afghanistan at this crucial time.
Ethnic groups like the one you belong to, women and children, how fearful are you for what life is going to be like for them?
All of the Afghans and everyone in Afghanistan right now, and of course there is a sense of a little bit sense of fear amongst the minorities, and women and children in particular are at, like, they feel the pressure, they feel the anxiety more than all of the other groups right now because of how vulnerable they are. When I talk with my mom and sisters, they are quite worried about what's it going to look like for them in the next few months or days, actually. So that's been quite a concern.
Safi, we hope that your family stays safe as they are now, but it's going to be a very uncertain period. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And Safi Ahmed currently works as the fundraising manager for the UNHCR, which remains on the ground in Afghanistan, assisting nearly 3 million internally displaced people. And that situation is only going to get worse as borders close, and the expectation is there's going to be a huge humanitarian crisis as many Afghans try to flee their country. Well, let's go back to the events of the past 24 hours, with Afghans, of course, waking up to this new reality. Their country is back under Taliban control after 20 years of war. Armed militants have taken the capital, as we've reported, completing a dizzyingly fast advance across the nation as the US states withdrew the last of its troops. There were reports that at least 5 people have been killed in the chaos at Kabul's international airport as people try to force their way onto planes and get out. Here's our South Asia correspondent, James Oaten.
Panic and despair, many without hope. With Kabul airport the only way out of Afghanistan after a Taliban takeover, thousands tried in vain to board a flight to safety. That gunfire isn't from Taliban fighters. Witnesses claimed US troops fired into the air as they tried to disperse the crowds while trying to evacuate their own. The Taliban captured the capital without any resistance from the Afghan army. Militants took hold of the country's presidential palace, and the group claimed the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan was back. The war was over. President Ashraf Ghani had fled the country. It all happened in a matter of hours. Even the Taliban leadership was surprised.
The way we have come through was unexpected, as we have reached the position which was never expected.
The Taliban has vowed to build peaceful relations with other nations. But those inside the country, especially women, fear a return to a regime that imposed brutal punishments.
The Taliban came into our village in the night. After a few days, we managed to escape as they were murdering the men and boys. They accused them of being in the army or the police.
The Taliban says it'll reveal what the new regime will look like. Under the old regime, women couldn't complete their education, pursue a career, or even leave the house without a man.
I might face consequences that I never even dreamed of. And I guess that's the price that we pay for trying to make this world a little better.
The price of a 20-year war borne not only by Afghanistan, but by thousands of foreign troops who sacrificed their lives for a better future. James Oaten, ABC News.
And the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has told US media that the pace of the Taliban takeover has surprised many.
It is certainly the case that the speed with which cities fell was much greater than anyone anticipated, including the Afghans, including many of the analysts who looked hard at this problem. And part of the reason for that is because at the end of the day, despite the fact that we spent 20 years and tens of billions of dollars to give the best equipment, the best training, and the best capacity to the Afghan National Security Forces, we could not give them the will. And they ultimately decided that they would not fight for Kabul.
Well, Greg Barton is a professor in global Islamic politics at Deakin University, and he joins us out of Melbourne. Greg, great to talk to you. We hear the US there saying we couldn't give the Afghans the will to fight, but was this a catastrophic intelligence failure?
It was an execution, Bev. There's reason to believe that the intelligence agencies had good intelligence, that it wasn't being listened to by the political leadership, particularly in the White House, that President Biden was just tunnel visioned, blinkered in what he wanted to do and wouldn't take advice. He should have clearly interrogated the so-called peace treaty signed on in February 2020 under the Trump administration and put some checks and balances in and slowed things down. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to get out. And unfortunately, that's probably going to be the defining mistake of his presidency.
Yeah. How, though, did the Taliban pull off this rapid collapse?
It was a collapse of morale, a collapse of confidence in the political elite in Kabul, but it was really set up to failure by that peace agreement, really false peace agreement in February 2020. So what the Americans were asking the Afghan military to do was to fight for a draw. The Taliban were fighting to win. A lot of these guys on front lines were not being paid. They weren't getting supplies. The Taliban clearly spent some months undermining, negotiating for surrenders. And in the end, when the US pulled out of Bagram Air Base back in July, took out all the civilian contractors who supported the Afghan Air Force, did all the maintenance, it left the Afghan military without any good options. And so it's not surprising morale collapsed. For a long time, the Taliban were concentrating on taking rural districts. It was only in the last 9 days we saw this blitzkrieg that took cities, but they'd planned for this for a long time, and the US played into their hands. The Biden administration played into their hands and gave them a perfect storm situation to take advantage of.
Yeah, so the Taliban that sat around during those peace negotiations, was it a smokescreen? Were they pretending to be a group that had reformed and changed and had this plan all along?
We don't know what was going through the minds of the individuals involved. I mean, there are factions in the Taliban. Perhaps some of those in Doha were genuine, but basically, yes, it was a smokescreen. It was a smoke and mirrors operation to distract and to mislead the US, and they went for it hook, line, and sinker.
Is this going to be a bloodbath of unparalleled proportions?
No, I think the good news is that it won't be a bloodbath of unparalleled proportions. It may be a hellish few years or longer to come. If there's anything good about what's happened this last few days and few weeks, is that we haven't had major military confrontations, and that means there hasn't been major loss of lives. We have many stories, though, of people being dragged out of their homes and shot. Even today, even the last few hours, there are stories coming from Kabul of Taliban going door to door looking for people who'd worked with international forces. So we're going to hear many tales of tragedy, it would seem. There will be a lot of human suffering, but it won't be on the scale of thousands and thousands of lives being lost at once. It'll be a series of individual tragedies and a sense of fear and oppression, particularly for women.
Yes. Greg, I'd love to get your expertise now in terms of just the implications of this longer term, the regional implications. Will this usher in a new extreme Islamic wave, a new terror wave?
I think a short answer is yes. I think that's what we should expect. I think we've been delusional for 20 years about Afghanistan and set ourselves up for this failure. I think we now need to face the difficult reality that we're back to the 1990s, back pre-2001. Al-Qaeda probably has 3 or 4 times as many fighters as it did then around the world, particularly across Africa in insurgencies. And they're very much joined at the hip with the Taliban. They now have safe sanctuary in Afghanistan. They may not stick their head up for a while. They don't want to draw attention to themselves, but there's likely to be a flow of foreign fighters, so-called, back to Afghanistan for training to take their jihad home. That's how Al-Qaeda began in 88. That's how Jamaat Islamiyah was formed in 93. That's where our problems come from, and we've set the scene for this to be repeated. It's a dreadful and potentially very costly mistake. Will
that be their focus? They talked, we're hearing their spokespeople, you know, it's a very different sort of presentation that they're giving us, talking about women being allowed, girls being allowed to go to schools, that they have greater responsibility to the civilians of Afghanistan. But will their focus continue to be this kind of training of Islamic jihads?
I think their focus is very much on this ideal of having an Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as they say. So that will satisfy them, but that entails conditions that at their worst probably won't be that much different from the Islamic State Caliphate in Syria and Iraq. So we've seen that movie before. It's pretty awful, as indeed the people of Afghanistan have in the 1990s when the Taliban was awful. We don't know how quickly they'll move into that mode of savagery. There's perhaps a window of opportunity to play to their desire to, spin this new image. And that may give us days, weeks, even months to get people out of Kabul International Airport to keep it open. That's clutching at straws, but that's the best thing that we can hope for at this point.
Let's look at the role of Russia, China. We heard the China spokesperson saying they're hoping to develop strong relations and help them rebuild the nation. How strategic could Afghanistan become in terms of China's role in the region?
Look, Afghanistan and the Taliban are more downside than upside for Beijing. But counterintuitively, as often the case with China today, our best hope perhaps of dealing with climate change involves working with China. Our best hope of stabilizing the situation in Afghanistan involves pressure from Beijing on the Taliban leadership so that they feel that they can get something. They're not going to listen to the head of the UN. They probably won't listen to the American president. They may listen to Beijing. They may listen to Islamabad. They may listen to Tehran because they need their neighbors. Their needs are modest, but they need to trade through the borders of this landlocked country. So there's some chance for leverage there. So it's a pity that our relations, the West's relations with China, are at an all-time low, because now is a chance to work together on common interests. China stands to lose a lot from a Taliban leadership in its neighbour. It doesn't want this, I'm sure, but it's going to try and make the best of it.
I want to ask you a question that's been asked many times today. Was this ultimately a terrible and tragic waste of lives and billions of dollars?
It's fast becoming that. It's not yet over. I mean, I think there was a hope, if we'd had this conversation a week ago, that there'd be some sort of civil war that would keep Kabul and Jalalabad and some other cities safe and preserve some things. That hasn't happened, clearly, but there hasn't been the massive bloodshed either. I think if there can be some leverage on the Taliban, there's not much leverage to be had, given they've been playing this game of smoke and mirrors with peace treaties. Nevertheless, there's some hope that they will allow some people to leave through the airport or across the land borders, and that they won't go all out on repression. And if that can happen, then some measure of civil society can remain, some measure of empowered women's movement and education can remain. I'm not optimistic, but a lot's been achieved the last 20 years, Bev, and we shouldn't be giving it up lightly. I mean, we owe the people of Afghanistan everything we can do to try and make this work. And if we can't help them directly, at least through the diaspora community here in Australia, but also in refugee camps where a lot of people are going to need our help.
Yes, that is going to be the next issue to watch, and is highly expected, a huge wave of refugees. Greg, always wonderful to get your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Well, the death toll from a devastating earthquake in Haiti has soared to almost 1,300. Rescue teams are finding more bodies as they desperately search for survivors in the rubble. The 7.2 magnitude quake hit the Caribbean nation on Saturday, flattening buildings in several cities. Hospitals are overwhelmed in the southwestern city of Leyte, which was hit the hardest. The US Coast Guard has joined rescue efforts, while Mexico and Colombia are sending emergency aid packages. Haiti has spent the past decade trying to rebuild its infrastructure after an earthquake in 2010, which killed more than 200,000 people. Malaysia's Prime Minister has resigned after just 17 months in office, saying he'd lost the confidence of the majority of lawmakers in Parliament. Pressure had been mounting on Muhyiddin Yassin following his refusal to drop graft charges against some fellow politicians. In a televised address, Mr Yassin said he hoped a new government could be formed soon.
Saya tidak akan sekali-kali bersekongkol.
I will never work together with kleptocrats, interfere with the independence of the judiciary, and turn my back against the federal constitution just to stay in power.
Saya berharap kerajaan baru nanti.
I hope the new government can be formed as soon as possible, so that the administration of this nation is not disrupted and can run as usual. The next 2 months is very important because we hope to achieve herd immunity in October.
Protests have erupted after at least 28 people were killed and dozens more injured in a fuel tank explosion in northern Lebanon. The army says it had seized the tank hidden by black marketeers and was handing out gasoline to residents when the explosion occurred. Protesters, already angry at the country's economic crisis, have tried to storm the Prime Minister's residency. Lebanon is experiencing a severe fuel shortage and hospitals could be forced to shut in the coming days as a result. Militant group Hezbollah says it will start importing gasoline and diesel from Iran. Well, hundreds of people have been evacuated from their homes in Spain, where bushfires are burning under heatwave conditions. The military has been called in to help firefighters protect homes after weeks of blazes. In Avila, northwest of Madrid, 400 people were moved out, while hundreds more were forced to flee in Castellón, near Valencia. On Saturday, Spain registered a provisional national temperature record of 47.4 degrees Celsius. Well, the Delta strain has now claimed more lives in New South Wales. A further 478 cases have been discovered there. 8 more people have died. Here's Ashley Raper.
Precious cargo from Poland has arrived. Extra Pfizer is now headed to help Sydney's west and southwest as the state's crisis deepens.
Our community transmission numbers are disturbingly high. We had 478 cases of community transmission.
Of the cases, less than a third can be linked. 61 were infectious in the community, but it's unknown whether a further 290 cases were isolating. 4 prisoners have tested positive at Silverwater Jail. There has also been an outbreak at St George Hospital, with 3 patients on the oncology ward and 2 staff members being infected. And the virus is continuing to spread within Nepean Hospital. There are now 30 cases from separate outbreaks in the mental health facility and across other wards.
I just want to confirm that Nepean Hospital, including emergency department, remains open and all precautions have been put in place.
The state has recorded its highest number of COVID deaths in a single day. 15-year-old Osama Saba had the virus but succumbed to pneumococcal meningitis. He died at Sydney Children's Hospital. A man in his 40s with underlying health issues died at Liverpool Hospital, along with a man in his 70s who is now the 8th death from the outbreak within the hospital. Another resident from an aged care facility in Summer Hill has died in RPA Hospital. 3 men in their 80s have also died, and a woman in her 70s.
The death of anyone is tragic, and it stresses the gravity of the situation.
And as the situation escalates, Dr. Chand has this sobering outlook.
I do not see vaccination as a silver bullet.
The Premier too concedes that even having 80% of the adult population vaccinated won't solve the current problem.
If you have 500 cases a day at 80%, that is still dangerous just to say let it rip. You can't let it rip.
So now the message is the state can't vaccinate its way out of this. Vaccination rates going up has to coincide with cases coming down. But even then, New South Wales will be a long way from returning to normal.
So long as Delta has presence in the world, even if we had 0 cases and we were at 80% double dose, you would still have to respect some rules.
The rules, it seems, are the only things we can count on. Ashley Raper, ABC News, Sydney.
The ACT's lockdown has been extended by another fortnight too after its current outbreak grew by 19 cases in the past 24 hours. Like Melbourne, the ACT's stay-at-home orders will now run until at least the 2nd of September, and the Northern Territory government has announced a snap 72-hour lockdown after a COVID case was detected in the community there. NT Chief Minister Michael Gunner says it's not clear how the man in his 30s became infected with the virus.
Critically, we do not know the source of his infection. We do not know if he caught it in hotel quarantine during his time at the Canberra airport or at any other time during his transit.
The lockdown applies to Greater Darwin and the Katherine region. And in just over an hour from now, Melbourne will be back under curfew amid tighter restrictions and an extended lockdown. The Victorian Premier says he had no choice but to toughen the COVID response to get Melbourne back in front of this latest outbreak. In the past 24 hours, the state recorded 22 new locally acquired cases. 8 of those had been in the community while infectious, and 5 have no known links. Here's Bridget Rollison.
This is an illegal engagement party with around 70 guests held in the middle of lockdown as the host jokes about breaking COVID restrictions.
And clearly this is legal because this is a group therapy session.
An infected person attended the St Kilda East celebration, and there are now fears the party could become a super spreading event.
It's selfish. They are shitty choices, and they will keep us all locked down for longer than we should be.
It's gatherings like these that have prompted the state government to impose a strict curfew and extend the lockdown for another 2 weeks.
We are right on the cliff edge here, but that if we can pull back from it, we can absolutely get to the finish line that we know we want to get to.
Playgrounds will also close, large construction projects will be reduced to 25% capacity, and all workers will need a permit.
Extending the lockdown was always on the cards, but reimposing the curfew, closing down playgrounds, my goodness, that's just cruel.
Masks will no longer be allowed to be removed to drink alcohol in public after organised pub crawls at the weekend saw people gather in large groups.
Take away, not hang around and turn the footpath into a pub.
There are 8 clusters that have health authorities worried in Newport, West Footscray, Middle Park, Wyndham Vale, the City of Melbourne, Glenroy, Lygon Street in Carlton and St Kilda East, where the source of the virus remains a mystery.
When we have all these mystery cases that are still coming through, it implies that there are other cases of transmission out there that we've not yet detected. We will only find them if people come forward to get tested.
3 people who were at the illegal engagement party have now tested positive, and pop-up testing has been set up in the St Kilda East area. Police say every adult at the party will be fined.
That's going to be over $350,000 worth of fines. That's an expensive engagement party.
The community is compliant, the community is doing the right thing, the community is angry and frustrated that this small group of people did do the wrong thing.
The list of exposure sites has now passed 530, and it includes a public housing tower in Carlton's Lygon Street, where 2 mystery cases have been found, and the Pascoe Vale Road Market in Glenroy. Victorians are clearly fatigued by these repeated lockdowns, but the government believes if it doesn't act now with these tough measures, our daily case numbers could reach 100 within a fortnight. The big challenge now is to get all Melburnians to comply. Bridget Rollison, ABC News, Melbourne. And Queensland's toughest border clampdown since the big pandemic began is about to get even stricter, with essential workers, even with exemptions, to be locked out unless they have at least 1 COVID jab. Tempers flared at checkpoints as hundreds of vehicles were turned around.
One after one, they did a U-turn, locked out of COVID-free Queensland.
Just driving to work as normal this morning. Didn't realise all the changes that happened overnight.
It was chaotic and confusing as traffic backed up for hours, from newspaper delivery drivers
hoping to get home
to people with medical appointments.
They are only allowing for medical and medical emergency and other purpose, I think.
No one really knows if they can cross over or not.
This first day or so is always a period of adjustment in the community.
From Friday, essential workers, even with exemptions, will face a no jab, no entry policy.
These strict border measures are necessary and they will be enforced.
The workers will have to prove they've had at least 1 dose of a COVID-19 vaccine.
And then 3 weeks later for Pfizer, 8 weeks later for AstraZeneca have their 2nd dose.
The crackdown has also caused mayhem at this school, with at least 30 teachers now locked out because they live in New South Wales.
Oh, that's insane. I don't know how teachers can't be considered essential workers.
Tweed businesses who can't get Queensland staff into work are also fuming.
Yeah, 4 people in Queensland who are living 100 metres from us or 200 metres from us, and they can't really get to us.
Authorities say the best option is for New South Wales to move its border further south temporarily.
The offer's there and we're happy to work through. There's a number of operational issues to work through.
But time is running out, as Delta has now been found in sewage as far north as Lennox Head.
So we are very concerned.
Queensland has recorded no new community cases for a 2nd day in a row. And while Ironside State School reopened today, nearly 3,500 people remain in home quarantine due to the outbreak in this area. As for masks, we'll know on Sunday if the mandate is to be lifted. More jabs into arms are being delivered in areas like Logan and Caboolture, where the uptake has been low. Lexi Hamilton-Smith, ABC News.
Carlton great Eddie Betts has announced his retirement from AFL football. The 34-year-old took to Instagram to thank his fans, the Carlton and Adelaide football clubs and his family. This weekend's game against GWS will be his 350th and final game. A three-time All-Australian, the skillful small forward has kicked 638 goals across his 16-year career. And tennis great Roger Federer has an uncertain future after pulling out of the upcoming US Open with a knee injury. The 40-year-old will have a third surgery on his troublesome right knee. The winner of 20 Grand Slam titles says his injury was aggravated at Wimbledon and he didn't play in the Olympics.
I want to give myself a glimmer of hope also to return to the tour in some shape or form. I am realistic, don't get me wrong. I know how difficult it is at this age.
The Swiss star says he's likely to be on crutches for weeks and will be out of the game for months. Before we go, our top stories tonight. The Taliban says it's begun the process of forming government a day after taking control of Afghanistan and seizing the presidential palace in Kabul. Desperate to escape, hundreds of civilians have rushed onto the tarmac at Kabul's international airport, with several killed while desperately trying to climb on the outside of planes. Another 8 deaths and almost 500 new cases of COVID in New South Wales as a curfew looms for Victoria. The ACT has extended its lockdown by another 2 weeks. And Malaysia's Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin resigns, saying he's lost the support of the majority of the parliament. And that is your world for this Monday. More world news and interviews can be found at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Hope to see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.